Hello, and welcome to Back to the Science. I'm Dr. Susan Oliver, and I'm a scientist, and this is Cindy Oliver, and she's a doc. Now, I'm sure you're all familiar with the saying, damned if you do, and damned if you don't. Well, that's certainly the case for me when it comes to making videos about John Campbell. If I make a video about him, I get a ton of comments saying, why do you keep making videos about John Campbell? Why don't you make videos about other things? But if I don't make videos about him, I get comments saying, why aren't you making videos about John Campbell? Here's an example. Dr. Susan, why can't you use more accurate data? Why don't you start to debunk yourself? Why don't you, like many others, start to investigate the real people like Dr. John Campbell again? He admitted he was wrong and he is bringing out a lot of truths. You have not in a month tried to debunk him. If he was wrong, then you would have tried to debunk him daily. My conclusion? Go on retirement. And I checked, this person is right that I haven't made a video debunking John Campbell in over a month. We will shortly be rectifying that. But first, I would just like to point out that the fact that I'm not making videos debunking him daily is not evidence that he's not wrong. First of all, I have a life. I have better things to do with my time than watch all of John Campbell's videos and debunk them. But even if I didn't have better things to do, it would still be not possible to debunk him daily. And that is because of Brandolini's law, which states the amount of energy needed to refute bullshit is an order of magnitude bigger than that needed to produce it. Anyway, I decided to have a look and see if he had any new videos out. And it turns out he did. He had a new video called Proof. How intriguing. Now, you may be wondering what he had proof of. I'm wondering this too, because I watched the whole video and the only thing I saw proof of was the fact that John doesn't understand what proof is and that he is completely clueless when it comes to assessing scientific papers. But of course, we already knew that. His video is about the following paper: excess mortality across countries in the Western world since the COVID-19 pandemic. Our World in Data estimates of January 2020 to December 2022, which a number of people have already pointed out doesn't provide proof of anything. And that includes the journal that published it. Let me just read what the BMJ has said. Various news outlets have claimed that this research implies a direct causal link between COVID-19 vaccination and mortality. This study does not establish any such link. The researchers looked only at trends in excess mortality over time, not its causes. While the researchers recognise that side effects are reported after vaccination, the research does not support the claim that vaccines are a major contributing factor to excess deaths since the start of the pandemic. Vaccines have, in fact, been instrumental in reducing the severe illness and death associated with COVID-19 infection. The message of the research is that understanding overall excess mortality since the COVID-19 pandemic is crucial for future health policy, but that identifying specific causes is complex due to varying national quality data and reporting methods. We could stop there, but let's have a listen to what John has to say.
But let's get into what we have got here. So this is excess mortality across countries in the Western world. This is the paper, and it's from the British medical journal Public Health. Very thorough paper.
Honestly, this is one of the least thorough analyses I've ever seen. The authors haven't even done the most basic of analysis, like, for instance, comparing the excess deaths with COVID deaths. even though the COVID death information is available from the same source as they got the excess death information. Luckily for us, other people have stepped up to the plate and have done this. Here's a graph prepared by Uncle John Returns, who you can follow on the platform formerly known as Twitter. And as you can see, excess mortality very closely follows COVID mortality. Who would have thought? And this information is also readily available on a country-by-country basis. And it's even available up to the end of 2023 and not just the end of 2022, as was used in the paper. This figure here shows the information for a selected number of countries. The black lines show excess deaths and the red lines show COVID deaths. And if you're wondering why the black lines are a bit hard to see in a lot of the charts, it's because they're underneath the red lines. And that's because excess deaths and COVID deaths are tightly correlated. Now, it's particularly strange that the authors didn't do this because they are using a method to calculate the excess deaths from a paper by Kolinsky and Kobach. And one of the primary points made in Kolinsky and Kobach's article was the fact that the excess death tracked closely with COVID deaths. You would have thought that they would have checked whether this was still the case, given how simple it was to do. But the authors didn't. Another obvious analysis that could have been done would have been to compare whether excess deaths correlate with COVID deaths or with vaccinations. And it just so happens that this data is also readily available. In fact, Professor Jeffrey Morris, who is an epidemiologist, has just run this data for 100 countries up to the end of 2023. Now, 25 of these countries are shown on this slide here, and I'll sort of swap over and show you the other slides as I'm talking so that you can see the other 75. And if you want to look at them in more detail, I'll provide a link to where you can find them in the video's description. So excess deaths are in black with grey shading. COVID deaths are in red, and both are shown on the same scale. Vaccinations are shown in blue, and whereas both excess deaths and COVID deaths are shown at a rate of per million, vaccinations are shown at a rate of per 1,000. And when you look at them, a few things are clear. Firstly, high excess deaths predominantly occur in spikes. Secondly, these spikes just happen to correspond to spikes in COVID deaths. Thirdly, spikes in excess deaths do not correspond with vaccinations unless there are spikes in COVID deaths at the same time. And that's not the case for most countries. The close correspondence between COVID deaths and excess deaths makes it clear that COVID deaths are the primary drivers of excess deaths, not just in 2020, but throughout 2021 and 2022 as well. In 2023, excess deaths are minimal in most countries. The authors of the study also could have compared deaths of vaccinated people with unvaccinated people, as has been done in many studies, but they didn't. And I'll just take you through one of those studies now. What they did in this study is they compared non-COVID and all-cause mortality following either first or second dose of the Pfizer, Moderna or J&J COVID vaccines with a match cohort who weren't vaccinated. 6,974,817 unique individuals were included in the study, and they were aged 12 and over. Importantly, they adjusted the results for confounders to account for differences between vaccinated and unvaccinated people. And this table here shows the results. It shows the hazard ratios for mortality of COVID vaccine recipients compared with unvaccinated comparison groups. So if the hazard ratio is below 1, it means that mortality is lower in the vaccine group. And if the hazard ratio is above 1, it means that mortality is higher in the vaccine group. And as you can see, for all vaccines and all doses and all types of mortality, your risk of dying is lower if you are vaccinated. The authors of the paper that John is presenting could even have compared the excess death rate in highly vaccinated regions with the excess death rate in less vaccinated regions. But they didn't. But here's a study that did do that. They compared excess mortality rates in the 10 most highly vaccinated US states with those in the 10 least vaccinated states from the 27th of June 2021 until the 26th of March 2022. And these are the results here. In the 10 most vaccinated states, which had an average vaccination rate of 73%, the excess mortality was 65.1 per 100,000. Whereas for the 10 least vaccinated states, it is 193.3 per 100,000, which is almost 3 times as much. So no, this is not a thorough analysis. In fact, the analysis is so basic, it's hard to believe that it got through peer review and was published as an original research study. The paper does not contain any original research. It just regurgitates publicly available data. Worse still, the paper contains a number of statements that are simply bollocks. And we'll just give you one example, but there are many, many more. The paper makes the following statement. For children aged 0 to 19 years, the infection fatality rate was set at 0.0003%. This implies that children are rarely harmed by the COVID-19 virus. Both these statements are bollocks. Firstly, we know that the infection fatality rate for children aged 0 to 9 years was considerably higher than 0.0003. This chart shows COVID mortality by age in the US. If we add up the 3 age groups that are under 18, we get 1,852. There are approximately 80 million children in this age group in the US. Let's be generous and assume that every single one of these children caught COVID prior to being vaccinated. This would equate to an infection fatality rate of 0.002%, which is an order of magnitude higher than 0.0003%. And of course, we know that not every child caught COVID before they were vaccinated. The second statement is also patently false. Death is not the only way children can be harmed from COVID. A lot of children who got COVID required hospitalisation, and a lot of children are still suffering from long COVID. Anyway, let's go back to John and see what else he has to say about the study.
Now let's get straight down to some of the things that they are saying here. This is from the article that I've just looked at. By definition, these serious adverse events, vaccine adverse events, lead to either, I don't know if I'm allowed to mention that complication or not. It's rather confusing, but that's the complication there anyway. Are life-threatening, require inpatient or prolongation of hospitalisation, cause persistent, significant disability or incapacity. And this is really the first time this is starting to be talked about. Concern a congenital abnormality or birth defect. Congenital means present at birth, usually indicating abnormal fetal development. or include a medically important event according to medical judgment. So that is directly from this paper that we've just looked at, published in British Medical Journal Public Health. And I think you'll agree it's a level of frankness that we haven't seen before. The paper is still somewhat circumspect, but it's a level of frankness we haven't seen before.
What on earth is John going on about? This is just a definition of serious adverse events. You'll find the same definition for all clinical trials. These aren't events that have necessarily occurred, and they certainly aren't adverse events that are necessarily linked to the vaccine. No idea why he thinks this is a level of frankness that hasn't been seen before. Unless he's stupid enough to think this is something other than a simple definition. Surely he can't be that naive.
Increased mortality, and of course we know the countries that didn't have as much increased mortality are often the Western countries, but the Eastern European Western countries where vaccination rates were lower. Not saying it's the cause, but that is an observation that we have all made. In fact, fairly obvious observation, really, to be quite honest.
Did John even read the paper that he is presenting? They provide a chart showing excess mortality in all countries that they have included in the study. The countries with the highest excess mortality are Albania, Bosnia and Herzegovina, Bulgaria, Lithuania, North Macedonia, and Serbia. All countries in Eastern Europe. And with the exception of Lithuania, all the countries have low vaccination rates.
They say excess mortality has remained high in the Western world for 3 consecutive years. Western world, 3 consecutive years. Despite the implementation of COVID containment measures and COVID vaccinations. So really, if these methods were so effective, you'd expect these to bring the mortality way down, but it has. It's not what we see.
Well, vaccines can only be effective if people actually take them. People who choose not to be vaccinated are not going to get the benefits of vaccination when they are infected with COVID. As you can see in this chart, which compares COVID death rates amongst unvaccinated people with vaccinated people in the US, unvaccinated people were still dying after the vaccines were introduced. And they were dying at a much higher rate than those people who were vaccinated. And we also know that clinically vulnerable people require additional booster shots to maximise their protection against hospitalisation and death. And thanks to the efforts of people like John Campbell, not all of them are getting their boosters.
The secondary analysis of the placebo-controlled phase 3 randomised clinical trials of the mRNA COVID vaccines, and we did interview the author of this, Joe Freeman, about this. It shows that the Pfizer trial had a 36% higher risk of serious adverse events in the vaccine group as opposed to the placebo group. So 36% higher risk, 30% higher risk. If people had told you this before we got vaccinated, wouldn't have touched it with a barge pole. Really, why weren't we told this in the original trial? Why did it take Joe Freeman to do a secondary analysis and his team to do a secondary analysis, as well as doing his day job as a doctor? Quite incredible. Anyway, that's the figures. 36% more serious adverse events in the vaccination group compared to the placebo group. The authors of the secondary analysis point out that most of these serious adverse events concern common clinical conditions. Now, these are common conditions that people get all the time, so very often they weren't linked to the vaccine. They just thought part of the rough and tumble of life. Disease occurs, unfortunately. So a lot of these are common clinical conditions. For example, ischemic stroke, lack of blood supply to the brain causing a stroke. Acute coronary syndrome, That's disruption of the blood supply to the myocardium, the heart muscle, and bleeding into the brain. But the fact that these are all common, of course, we see these all the time. Ischemic stroke, we see it commonly. Acute coronary syndrome are very common, very common. ST elevation, myocardial infarction, non-ST elevation, myocardial infarction. We see these commonly. With these being common, this commonality hinders clinical suspicion, and consequently, its detection as an adverse vaccine reaction.
Interestingly, the paper that John is talking about was also co-authored by Peter Dodgy, who just happens to be a senior editor at the BMJ. Now, of course, I'm not suggesting that the fact that Dodgy's paper was cited had any influence on the study being accepted by the BMJ. I just thought I'd mention it. Now, I have actually covered this paper before in another video, but I will just briefly explain why the claims that were being made in the original paper and are now being regurgitated in this new paper are bollocks. Firstly, the authors point out that the serious adverse events include things like ischemic stroke and acute coronary syndrome. They fail to mention that they also include things like traffic accidents, broken bones, alcohol poisoning, and diarrhea. Also, if we look at acute coronary syndrome, we see that there was one case in the vaccine group and one case in the placebo group in the clinical trial. So, no evidence at all that it is more common in the vaccine group. And we see exactly the same thing if we look at ischemic stroke. One case in the placebo group and one case in the vaccine group. So they've used two examples of adverse events that clearly aren't elevated following vaccination. Not exactly a compelling argument. But what about this 36% higher incidence of serious adverse events in the Pfizer group claim? It's basically smoke and mirrors. The correct way to analyse adverse events is to look at the number of people who suffered a serious adverse event, not the total number of serious adverse events. And the reason for this is because adverse events are often related to each other. For instance, you may suffer a broken bone in a car accident. This would count as two serious adverse events, but clearly they are related to each other. Likewise, diarrhea is often accompanied by abdominal pain. This would be counted as two adverse events, but they would both be occurring at the same time in the same person. Formal reporting systems for clinical trial adverse events require that all adverse events be entered, even when they are related, which is why analyses are done at the patient level. And needless to say, the regulatory authorities analyse the data in the correct way. And I'll just read you some of what their analysis showed. Among the 37,586 participants with a median of 2 months of follow-up after dose 2, from dose 1 to 1 month after dose 2, the proportions of participants who reported at least one serious adverse event were similar in the BNT 162BT group, 0.5%, and in the placebo group, 0.4%. The most frequently reported serious adverse events were in the cardiac disorders system organ class, 0.1% in each treatment group, nervous system disorders system organ class, 0.1% in each treatment group, and infections and infestations system organ class, 0.1% in each treatment group. They also observed the following. Amongst the 37,586 participants with a median of 2 months of safety follow-up after dose 2, no clinically meaningful differences in serious adverse events were observed by age, sex, race, ethnicity, or baseline SARS-CoV-2 status subgroups. So the only way they can show a problem is by doing a completely invalid analysis. But even then, the authors of the paper had to cook the books to make the difference statistically significant. This is the table that the 36% figure comes from. If you look at the 95% confidence interval, you can see that the lower bound is 1.02. So it is only just statistically significant. And of course, for Moderna, where serious adverse events were only 6% higher, the confidence interval includes 1, meaning it is not statistically significant. Strangely, this information was also included in the paragraph that John is quoting from, but he chose to leave it out from his printout. No idea why. Anyway, back to the table. We also see that when the two studies are combined, there is no significant difference between the number of adverse events in the vaccine and placebo groups. But there is still that slightly significant difference in the Pfizer group. Or is there? The authors of the paper actually removed some serious adverse events prior to doing the analysis. In the Pfizer analysis, SARS-CoV-2 test positive was removed from placebo events, which is fair enough. But suspected COVID-19 wasn't removed from the vaccine events. If it had been removed, it's likely that there would no longer be a statistically significant difference between the groups. And as you can see, I did point out this anomaly to the study's author, who did concede that an argument could be made to exclude suspected COVID. So if you do an invalid analysis and then further torture the data, you can convince the gullible. But vaccines are assessed by people who aren't so easily fooled. For instance, this recent nationwide study of over 1 million people aged 65 and over looked at adverse events after XBB 1.5 containing COVID-19 mRNA vaccines. And they looked at 28 adverse events from prioritised lists of adverse events of special interest to COVID-19 vaccines. No increased risk in any of these adverse events was observed following vaccination. So, in summary, despite the title of his video, John Campbell hasn't provided proof of anything other than the fact he doesn't understand what proof is, and he is completely clueless about how to assess a scientific paper. If you'd like to look further into the data I've presented, I've provided links in the video's description. And please remember, this video is about the science, but you shouldn't take it as medical advice. For that, you should speak to your medical practitioner. If you've got this far, thank you for listening. And if you've liked, shared, or commented on the video, double thank you, because that helps the algorithm and means that more people will see the video. And thank you to everyone who commented on what colour I should get my lounge suite recovered in last week. I am going to go with the turquoise, and you're actually seeing me sit on the grey lounge suite for the last time. It's been taken away in a couple of days. So next time you see me, I'll probably be sitting on the floor. But in a few weeks, you'll see me sitting on my new lounge suite, hopefully. Anyway, I'd also like to thank everyone who has bought me a coffee or little Cindy a treat. We really appreciate your support. And even though Cindy looks like she's sleeping very appreciatively. We will be continuing to make videos about the science in the future. So if you'd like to join the cool kids and stay informed, please hit the subscribe button. Thank you.